So back in 1975, there was this massive fire that swept through a government facility in St. Louis. And it basically erased the existence of 18 million American veterans from the historical record.
Just completely wiped them out.
Right, because there were no microfilm backups, nothing. Just a single localized blaze that destroyed lifetimes of military service data in a matter of hours.
Yeah, which is horrifying when you think about it.
It really is. But then you contrast that with this wild historical irony. Thousands of years ago in Mesopotamia, you had this conquering army that was determined to just absolutely obliterate a rival society. So they put their city to the torch.
As conquering armies do, yeah.
Right. But in doing so, they accidentally fired the city's sun-dried clay archives, basically like pottery in a kiln. So they ended up preserving their administrative history for eternity.
I love that. The absolute best thing that ever happened to Sumerian memory was an enemy trying to burn it to the ground.
Exactly. And that, it perfectly isolates the really terrifying paradox of historical preservation that we're getting into today.
Yeah, because we tend to conceptualize memory as this, static architecture, right?
Yeah.
You carve a stone, or you write a text, you put it on a shelf, and it just simply exists.
But it doesn't.
No, not at all. The physical legacy of human knowledge is fiercely volatile.
Yeah.
I mean, it's constantly subjected to the whims of weather, warfare, and aggressive state hoarding.
Which means we're dealing with some deeply diagnostic, muddy waters when it comes to the memory of our entire species. So welcome to our deep dive.
If you're listening right now, you are joining us for a really intense look at the raw mechanics of how societies capture, preserve, and pass on their knowledge to you and me, sitting here thousands of years later.
It's a huge topic, and we've got a fantastic stack of sources to work through today.
Yeah, we're pulling heavily from Ernst Posner's seminal work, Archives in the Ancient World, and specifically looking at the insights from the 2003 introduction by James M. O'Toole.
And finally, we're looking at a 1997 bulletin from the Grand Lodge of Alberta about the mechanics of Freemasonry.
Which I know might seem like incredibly disparate terrain to you listening at home, moving from Mesopotamian mud to 18th century fraternal rituals. But the through line is actually really rigid.
Yeah, how so?
Well, this entire deep dive is a study of how human beings engineer systems to fight back against the inevitability of forgetting. And critically, how the medium they choose fundamentally dictates the structure of the society itself.
Okay, so before we look at the physical architecture of these ancient preservation systems, we really need to look at the biological architecture of the human brain.
Right, the hardware.
Yeah. So O'Toole's introduction to Posner's book leans heavily on the work of scholars Eric Havelock and Jack Goody. They have these theories on the transition from an oral society to a literate one.
Yeah, and they essentially argue that the adoption of writing actually restructured the human mind.
Which, okay, I'm going to push back on this a little bit, because I have a fundamental issue with their premise. Havelock argues that it's no accident that analytical philosophy emerged from a literate world rather than an oral one.
Right.
But aren't they just completely dismissing the analytical capacity of oral cultures? I mean, we know indigenous oral histories possess incredibly complex ecological and legal and genealogical frameworks.
Oh, absolutely.
So are we really supposed to believe that humans couldn't engage in abstract analytical thought before the invention of the alphabet? It feels a bit like our modern panic about smartphones, right? Outsourcing our brains to Google is ruining us. Didn't the ancients worry writing would ruin them?
Well, yeah, Socrates famously complained about writing ruining memory. But that is a critical friction point you bring up. But to be fair to Havelock and Goody, they aren't arguing about the biological capacity for complex thought.
Okay, so what's their angle?
They're arguing about the mechanics of data storage and really cognitive bandwidth. Think about it. In a purely oral culture, if you want to ensure the survival of your cultural bedrock, so your laws, your defensive strategies, your tribal identity, that data must be encoded into rhythmic poetry or song to survive transmission across generations.
Because the human brain is literally the only available archive.
Exactly. That means a massive percentage of a society's intellectual elite must dedicate their cognitive bandwidth to the flawless memorization and recitation of these epic narratives.
Oh, wow. So the structure of the poetry itself is basically an act of data compression.
You nailed it.
That perfectly explains the repetitive epithets in Homer, doesn't it? Achilles is always brave Achilles or swift-footed Achilles.
Yes. Or the dawn is always rosy-fingered dawn.
Right. I always thought that was just a stylistic flourish, but it's actually a structural necessity. It functions as a mnemonic prompt so the storyteller doesn't lose the rhythm and drop crucial pieces of the narrative database.
Precisely. The mind is fundamentally tethered to the act of rigid preservation. But then you have the breakthrough of the Greek alphabet, right around the 8th century BCE.
And what made that so different?
Well, it allowed information to be stored reliably outside the individual human body. By exteriorizing the data onto a physical medium, you create an objectified record.
So you don't have to be the hard drive anymore.
Right. You no longer have to spend your entire life memorizing the tradition. You can write it down, place it on a table, stare at it, and really interrogate it. You can rearrange the concepts. You can introduce counterfactual variables.
So the argument is that writing didn't birth the ability to think philosophically. It just provided the structural leverage required to objectify a thought and subject it to sustained analytical rigor.
Without the constant looming fear that you would just forget the original premise while you were thinking about it.
That makes a lot of sense. So by externalizing the memory, you transform the human brain from a hard drive into a processor.
I like that analogy.
But, of course, the immediate consequence of that cognitive liberation is that societies begin generating just a staggering volume of external data.
Oh, absolutely. Massive amounts.
Right. Once you start writing down property boundaries and taxation rates and military conscription lists, you instantly have a physical storage problem. You have to invent the archive.
Which brings us right to Posner.
Yes! To understand the mechanics of the ancient archive, Ernst Posner's work is the undeniable bedrock here.
Yeah, his book, Archives in the Ancient World, published in 1972, it basically invented the entire academic framework for understanding historical record-keeping.
And his personal timeline, it adds such a profound psychological layer to his research.
It really does. It's an incredible story.
He was a decorated German-Jewish veteran of the First World War, and he ended up rising through the ranks of the Prussian State Archives in Berlin. So here is a man dedicating his entire life to meticulously preserving the structural memory of the state.
And then 1933 happens, the Nazi regime seizes power, and Posner is abruptly dismissed from his administrative posts.
His status as a frontline combat veteran temporarily delayed the worst of it, I think.
It did, yeah. But by 1938, following Kristallnacht, he gets swept up in mass arrests and sent to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp.
It is such a chilling juxtaposition. A scholar whose singular expertise is the preservation of civilization's memory is imprisoned by a state apparatus operating with the explicit goal of erasing entire populations from the historical record.
Yeah, the very archival mechanisms he studied his whole life were actively being weaponized for state terror. And he only survived Sachsenhausen because his wife, Katharina, just doggedly leveraged his war record to petition for his release. Yeah, they managed this really harrowing escape through Stockholm and London, and finally reached the United States in 1939. He actually joined the faculty at American University in Washington, D.C.,
where he translated all that deep European archival training into a sweeping analysis of human record-keeping stretching back millennia.
Exactly. And what he found was wild. He discovered that the bureaucratic machinery of the ancient world was virtually indistinguishable from our modern administrative state.
Which is so counterintuitive.
Right. He identified 6 pillars of ancient administration. These are constants in record creation that materialize the moment a society hits a certain threshold of density and complexity.
Okay, let's break these down for everyone listening, because the mechanics of these 6 pillars are universally applicable, right?
Right.
Because they solve fundamental problems of state control.
Right. So the first pillar is the establishment of laws. A complex society just cannot rely on customary oral judgments. It requires fixed, referenceable statutes to mediate disputes at scale.
That makes sense. What's the second?
The second is records of administrative activity. This is your day-to-day operational paperwork.
Like internal correspondence.
Exactly. State officials coordinate infrastructure, diplomacy, resource allocation, all that mundane stuff.
Okay, and the third pillar is where the true engine of the state lives, right? Financial and accounting records.
Oh, yeah. The sources highlight that across basically every ancient civilization, accounting documents are by far the most numerous artifacts recovered. The state requires a constant influx of capital to function.
Which naturally necessitates the fourth pillar, land ownership and tax records.
They've got to know who to tax.
Exactly. To extract capital, the state has to map the economic landscape. It needs granular data on who controls which agricultural yield to calculate equitable or, at least enforceable taxation.
Right. And then the fifth pillar is records facilitating control over persons, because the state needs human capital just as much as financial capital.
So this would be census data.
Census data, military conscription list, registers for forced public labor, all of that.
And the final pillar is notarial records. And this is interesting because this is where the state bridges the gap into the private lives of its citizens.
Yeah, the government provides an official, sanctioned repository for private business transactions. So contracts, wills, bills of sale.
By acting as the guarantor of private agreements, the state entrenches its own legitimacy directly into the daily economic lives of the population.
It's a very smart feedback loop. And when you look at the functional reality of these 6 pillars, it really strips away the monumental mythos of the ancient world.
It totally does. We always envision Greco-Roman Egypt through this lens of pharaohs and deities and massive architectural triumphs.
But Posner's research drags us right down into the administrative offices, and it reveals an environment of striking bureaucratic mundanity.
There is a detail from Posner's findings in Greco-Roman Egypt that I absolutely love. It perfectly illustrates this. Amidst the grand sweep of history, archaeologists found this scrap of papyrus that was functionally a panicked internal memo from a clerk.
Oh, the sticky note.
Yes. It literally reads, "See where the contract of Alexander with the son of blank has gone."
It's amazing.
It is the exact same clerical anxiety you would find in a modern corporate office when a critical file is misplaced, like, where did Dave put the Alexander file?
Exactly. And they also had highly pragmatic document retention and appraisal life cycles. They didn't just keep everything forever.
Right. When administrative papyri in Egypt were deemed legally obsolete or they just no longer had fiscal utility, they weren't simply discarded.
No. The state recouped a fraction of the material cost by selling the used files in bulk to local embalmers.
Which is so grim, but so practical. The embalmers repurposed the papyrus to wrap mummies.
It's brilliant from a resource management perspective.
Yeah.
But it creates a really bizarre scenario for modern Egyptologists today.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah. They have to carefully unwrap these sacred human remains only to discover they were reading, like, a localized tax receipt for grain from a century prior.
That is hilarious. The sacred text. Wait, this is a receipt for barley.
Pretty much. And we see robust destruction policies in Republican Rome, too.
Oh, right. Following a state-mandated tax amnesty where civilian debts were forgiven, the magistrates physically gathered the wooden tax tablets in the forum and staged a massive public bonfire.
Yeah, the physical destruction of the record was the legal mechanism that enacted the amnesty. The destruction of the record was the policy.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. Because this high degree of structural similarity between ancient and modern bureaucracies, it ignited a massive academic debate following the publication of Posner's work.
It did. Scholars started to question if this interpretation was structurally flawed by our own modern biases.
Like, are we falling into the trap of anachronism? If we go looking for beige filing cabinets and dedicated clerical staffs in ancient Athens, just because that is how we organize data today, aren't we going to force the archaeological evidence to fit our preconceived corporate framework?
Exactly. And in the 1990s, the scholar Rosalind Thomas offered a really severe critique of Posner's model on those exact grounds.
What was her argument?
She argued that historians suffer from a rationalist view of writing. Because our modern administrative state uses writing almost exclusively for bureaucratic efficiency and objective data storage, we incorrectly assume ancient societies utilized writing for the exact same utilitarian purposes.
Okay, so if they weren't just storing data, what were they doing with writing?
Well, Thomas pointed out that in many ancient contexts, the act of writing wasn't about data retrieval at all. It was highly symbolic, performative, or even magical.
Magical.
Yeah. We see this with ancient curse tablets. Citizens would inscribe curses against rivals or debtors onto sheets of lead, fold them up, and bury them in graves or wells.
Whoa. So the writing wasn't meant to be read by a clerk or archived for legal precedent?
No, the physical inscription itself was believed to activate the magic. The word itself was the mechanism of power.
That completely changes the context of an archive.
And furthermore, Thomas pointed to the geopolitical reality of Sparta.
Oh, the Spartans.
Yeah. Here was a dominant, highly organized military superpower in the Greek world that functioned entirely without the use of written administrative archives.
Wait, really? No archives at all?
None. Their societal cohesion, their military logistics, their legal frameworks, all of it was maintained through rigorous oral tradition and really strict social engineering. So her argument was that Posner's 6 pillars were not an inevitable evolutionary endpoint for all complex societies.
That is a fascinating counterpoint. But then James Sickinger entered the debate to aggressively defend Posner's framework, right?
He did, and Sickinger had a massive piece of structural evidence on his side.
The Athenian Matroon.
Exactly. Thomas might be right about magical lead tablets in specific localized contexts, but Sickinger demonstrated that the Greeks absolutely possessed a highly developed, rationalist archival mentality.
So what exactly was the Matroon?
It's this really fascinating architectural hybrid. It was located in the Athenian Agora, and originally it served as a sanctuary dedicated to the Mother of the Gods. But by the end of the 5th century BCE, the Athenian state had co-opted this sacred space to serve as the central, highly organized repository for state documents.
The psychological mechanism there is just brilliant. You place the property deeds and the legislative decrees and the financial audits directly inside the temple of a powerful deity. The religious aura of the space transfers directly to the documents, granting them unassailable legal authority and physical protection.
Right, because you do not mess with a contract housed under the gaze of the Mother of the Gods.
Exactly. And Sickinger's research revealed the Matroon was not just a static storage vault either. It was a dynamic, functioning bureaucracy.
Oh yeah, they employed specialized personnel with strict divisions of labor. You had some clerks dedicated exclusively to copying fragile documents, while others managed retrieval and filing.
They engineered standardized chronological dating systems to ensure rapid document retrieval.
They even operated public reference services, allowing citizens to request precedent-setting documents required for ongoing litigation in the Athenian courts.
It fundamentally proves Posner's thesis. Once a society successfully engineers the mechanisms to control local state bureaucracy, taxes, the draft list, the property deeds, it naturally shifts its focus toward a much larger ambition.
Because if local archives solve the problem of immediate administrative control, the logical next step for an expanding empire is to centralize historical, philosophical, and cultural texts.
Which marks the transition from the functional state archive to the monumental mega-library. We're moving from just administrative efficiency to total ideological dominance.
Yes, but this transition requires an entirely different set of logistical and economic frameworks. And to understand how these massive libraries functioned, we're relying heavily on the data synthesized in Lionel Casson's libraries in the ancient world.
And the review of Casson's work dismantles this really pervasive modern assumption. We tend to view the ancient world as overwhelmingly illiterate.
Yeah, we assume it's just sword-swinging barbarians and a few monks.
Right. We operate under the assumption that only a microscopic fraction of elite aristocracy or cloistered religious figures possess the ability to read. We assume texts were impossibly rare and heavily guarded.
But Casson demonstrates that the economics of literacy, particularly within the Roman Empire, were shockingly robust and widespread.
The archaeological evidence from Pompeii provides the clearest diagnostic window into this, because the volcanic ash preserved the mundane realities of daily life, including the graffiti etched into the city walls.
And what do they find in that graffiti?
They find children practicing rudimentary alphabets. They find construction foremen scratching logistical tallies and localized political slogans. The literacy rate extended far down the socioeconomic ladder right into the working classes.
And because literacy was broad, the demand for reading material created a truly vibrant commercial book trade. I mean, first century Rome possessed dedicated bookstores concentrated in specific districts, operating with highly recognizable retail mechanics.
And the texts themselves were highly affordable. Casson highlights a quote from the Roman satirist Martial, who actively promoted the affordability of his own work.
What did he say?
He wrote, "This little slender book at Tryphon's store costs just 4 coppers and not a penny more. Is 4 too much, it puts you in the red. Then pay him 2, he'll still come out ahead."
That is literally direct-to-consumer marketing. He's emphasizing the low overhead of the paperback equivalent of his day.
Yeah. And this commercial ecosystem proves that books were not exclusively hoarded treasures, they were circulating commodities.
However, while the civilian population was purchasing cheap poetry at Tryphon's store, the absolute rulers of the Hellenistic world were operating on a completely different scale.
Oh, entirely.
They recognized that controlling the aggregate knowledge of the known world was the ultimate geopolitical leverage.
Which brings us to the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt and the aggressive acquisition strategies of the Great Library of Alexandria.
The Ptolemies possessed effectively limitless financial resources, and they weaponized that capital to transform Alexandria into the intellectual center of gravity for the entire Mediterranean.
And they didn't build their collection through, like, polite requests or patient monastic transcription.
No, they did not.
They utilized state-sponsored intellectual piracy.
The logistics of their operation were staggering. According to the ancient physician Galen, Ptolemy II instituted a naval decree requiring every single vessel entering the harbor of Alexandria to be boarded and systematically searched by state officials.
And they were not looking for smuggled tariffs or weaponry.
No, they were hunting for texts. If any manuscripts were found aboard, they were immediately seized and transported to the library.
The mechanics of what happened next are just incredible. The library's scribes would meticulously copy the seized manuscript. The library would then permanently enter the original text within their own vaults and return the freshly produced copy to the bewildered ship's captain as compensation.
It was literal state-sanctioned theft disguised as a public service.
Thanks for the original. Here's a photocopy. Have a great day.
Exactly. And they were equally ruthless in their diplomatic acquisition.
Oh, the story about the Athenian texts. This is wild.
Yeah. So the Athenians possessed the official state-sanctioned original manuscripts of the great tragic playwrights Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. These were the cultural crown jewels of Athens.
And Ptolemy II formally requested to borrow these originals under the pretext of having his scribes create accurate copies for the Alexandrian collection.
Right. But Athens, acutely aware of Ptolemy's reputation as a total book thief, demanded an exorbitant security deposit to guarantee the safe return of the scrolls. They settled on a deposit of 15 silver talents.
Just to understand the scale of this leverage for you listening, a single silver talent was roughly the equivalent of 9 years of skilled labor wages.
9 years.
So 15 talents was an astronomical sum. It was effectively the GDP of a small city-state. The Athenians believed the financial collateral was absolutely ironclad.
Of course they did. So they shipped the priceless originals to Alexandria. Ptolemy II immediately secured the scrolls within the library, ordered his scribes to produce high-quality copies, shipped those copies back to Athens, and just cheerfully forfeited the entire 15-talent deposit.
He didn't even blink. He absorbed the massive financial loss because the cultural capital of possessing the originals vastly outweighed the silver.
It's an unbelievable power move. But, you know, we really have to address the scale of this operation because the historical record is wildly inconsistent here.
Yeah, how massive did this collection actually become?
This is where we encounter significant historiographical friction. Legendary accounts and later chroniclers inflated the numbers dramatically. Some claim the library housed upwards of 700,000 scrolls.
Wow, 700,000.
Yeah, but modern scholars such as Roger Bagnall, whose analysis has heavily cited the Reddit Ask Historians debate we are examining, they apply strict archaeological and logistical reality checks to those claims.
So what does Bagnall think is a more realistic number?
He calculates a vastly reduced but highly realistic estimate of somewhere between 30,000 to 100,000 scrolls.
Okay, still huge, but not 700,000.
Right. And the primary metric he uses to justify this reduction is the physical footprint of Alexandria's main geopolitical rival, the Library of Pergamum in Asia Minor.
Right, because Pergamum was a fiercely competitive intellectual center.
Exactly. Extensive archaeological surveys of the surviving foundations at Pergamum indicate the physical structure could accommodate roughly 30,000 scrolls.
Even if we account for ancient claims that it held up to 200,000, which is what Mark Antony famously alluded to present to Cleopatra, the physical storage capacity simply cannot support those exaggerated numbers.
No, it can't. If Pergamum was considered a legitimate threatening rival to Alexandria, the mathematical probability that Alexandria possessed 500,000 more texts than its closest competitor is functionally zero. The architectural footprint required to house, catalog, and maintain 700,000 fragile papyrus scrolls would have dwarfed the palatial complex.
Okay, so the raw numbers might be debated, but the strategy is undeniable. Here's where it gets really interesting. By centralizing texts on the scale, Ptolemy was engineering a massive intellectual gravity well.
A gravity well, yeah, I like that.
Think about it. If you control the only comprehensive database of medical texts, engineering schematics, and philosophical treatises, you physically force the world's most brilliant scholars to migrate to your city.
Right, you drain the intellectual capital from rival nations because they simply cannot compete with your centralized resources.
It is the exact same mechanism we see with modern tech billionaires hoarding data today. It is framed as this noble endeavor to organize human knowledge, but mechanically it is a consolidation of global influence.
It is an assertion of absolute dominance. But the fatal flaw of the gravity well is that it creates a massive, catastrophic single point of failure.
Oh, yeah.
By funneling the aggregate memory of the Hellenistic world into a concentrated physical location, the Ptolemies unwittingly engineered the most fragile archive in human history.
Which brings us to the destruction myths, because popular culture has condensed the fall of the Library of Alexandria into a single apocalyptic cinematic event. A devastating fire that supposedly plunged humanity into a technological dark age.
Right, the dramatic burning of the library.
But the Ask Historians debate and Cassan's analysis really dismantle this narrative. It reveals a slow, agonizing process of attrition layered across multiple centuries.
Yeah, there is no single culprit. There are three primary historical suspects in the sources, and the blame shifts depending on the prevailing political or religious biases of the chronicler writing the history. We have to examine the mechanics of each phase impartially here.
Exactly. We're just reporting what the sources claim. So what's the first one?
The first major phase of destruction is attributed to Roman urban warfare in 270 AD. The Emperor Aurelian engaged in a brutal campaign to suppress a revolt in Alexandria.
And the fighting was highly concentrated in the palatial quarter, right?
Yes, the exact district housing the Great Library. The logistical reality of ancient siege tactics and urban combat strongly suggests the physical structure suffered catastrophic collateral damage and massive loss of texts during this conflict.
Okay, and the second phase?
That moves us forward to 390 AD, implicating early Christian factions. The sources note that Emperor Theodosius II issued sweeping decrees authorizing the dismantling of pagan sites of worship.
And in Alexandria, the Patriarch Theophilus aggressively executed these orders, culminating in the razing of the Serapeum.
Right, and the Serapeum was a monumental temple complex that housed a substantial daughter library containing overflow texts from the main collection.
While the physical architecture of the Serapeum was undoubtedly destroyed, historical accounts vary significantly on whether the specific scrolls housed within were entirely incinerated or if they had been previously relocated or salvaged.
Exactly. And the final major phase of destruction mentioned in the sources is traditionally attributed to the Arab conquest of Alexandria in 642 AD.
Right. According to this narrative, a scholar petitioned the Caliph Omar to preserve the remaining philosophical texts.
And Omar supposedly issued a rigid doctrinal decree. If the texts aligned with the Quran, they were redundant. If they contradicted it, they were heretical. The legend claims the remaining scrolls were distributed to the city's public baths and used as furnace fuel for 6 months.
But modern historiography views that bathhouse narrative as highly apocryphal, right? Like it was likely engineered by later political rivals.
Yes, exactly. But the cumulative conclusion drawn by the review of the vanished library is that arguing over who struck the final match fundamentally misses the point.
Why is that?
Because the structural vulnerability was the centralization itself. If you concentrate vital material in a single, highly contested geopolitical choke point, its eventual destruction by warfare, zealotry, or mere neglect is a statistical inevitability.
And we cannot solely blame human intervention either. The mechanical properties of the medium itself guaranteed a high attrition rate.
Oh, absolutely. Papyrus is an organic, highly reactive material. It degrades rapidly in humid environments. It is susceptible to insect damage, and the scroll format itself subjects the text to constant physical friction.
Think about it. Reading a scroll requires 2 hands to constantly unroll and re-roll the material. You're constantly wearing down the edges and stressing the fibers every single time you read it.
And that structural limitation of the scroll is what necessitated the transition to the codex format around the 1st century AD.
Which is basically the modern book.
Right, the codex is structurally identical to the modern bound book. It offered immense mechanical advantages. It allowed for writing on both sides of the material. It provided rigid protective covers. And it allowed a scholar to rapidly reference disparate sections without unspooling 20 feet of papyrus.
Hold on, let me check page 200. Wait, let me unroll this for 5 minutes.
Exactly. But even with the improved durability of the codex, the physical transmission of knowledge remained agonizingly slow. Without access to Chinese paper-making techniques or mechanical printing presses, every single replacement copy required hundreds of hours of manual, error-prone scribe labor.
This inherent fragility fuels the core friction in the Reddit Ask Historians debate. Did the gradual annihilation of the Alexandrian collection actually set human technological and philosophical progress back? Did we lose the blueprints for advanced machinery or the cures for diseases?
Well, there is a dominant, highly optimistic faction in that debate that argues the loss was largely superficial.
Oh, really? How do they justify that?
The optimistic framework relies on the mechanics of canonization. The argument asserts that the Great Library functioned as a massive editorial filter. The scholars in Alexandria collated vast amounts of disparate material, identified the most mathematically, medically, and philosophically significant texts, and established a formalized canon. Yeah, and because these texts were recognized as vital, they were aggressively copied and disseminated to smaller regional libraries throughout the Mediterranean and the Byzantine East. Therefore, by the time the central facility collapsed, the truly indispensable knowledge had already been decentralized and preserved elsewhere.
Okay, but a user in that debate, Sivioso, introduced a powerful counter-argument that completely fractures that optimistic view.
Yes, I love this point.
The optimists are exclusively analyzing the survival rate of literary and philosophical works. They assume that because the epic poetry of Homer or the geometric theorems of Euclid survived via mass dissemination, the system worked. But what about the millions of localized administrative documents?
Right, the foundational pillars of Posner's thesis that we talked about earlier.
Exactly. The grain yield analyses, the municipal census data, the localized tax receipts, the daily logistical correspondence of the state. If an Alexandrian scribe is tasked with reproducing text to export to a branch library in Rome, they are going to prioritize the high-status philosophical treatises. They are not going to dedicate hundreds of hours of manual labor to duplicate the municipal tax audit of an Alexandrian wheat merchant from 212 BCE.
No, nobody is copying that.
Right. So those mundane administrative records are never disseminated. They exist in a single location. When the library burns or simply rots away, that granular socioeconomic data is permanently annihilated.
Yeah.
To a historian attempting to reverse engineer how ancient economies actually functioned on a macro level, the loss of that mundane data is a catastrophic, irreplaceable blackout.
It is a devastating structural critique, and it maps flawlessly onto the 1975 National Personnel Record Center fire in St. Louis that we discussed right at the start of the deep dive.
It really does.
The military files of those 18 million veterans were the modern equivalent of ancient mundane data. They were not the Declaration of Independence, they were routine, standardized bureaucratic forms tracking promotions, deployments, and medical histories.
And because they lacked high-status cultural prestige, they were never prioritized for duplication or microfilm backup. They were centralized in a single physical location without redundancy.
Exactly. When the fire broke out, the mechanical reality of paper dictated the permanent erasure of that history.
And the scary part is, we're still actively losing this battle against the elements today. The 1997 Masonic Bulletin we reviewed includes a stark, immediate example of this vulnerability.
Oh, the Nevada flood.
Yes. The document contains an urgent appeal for administrative relief because severe flooding along the Truckee River in Reno, Nevada, had breached the Grand Lodge and devastated their centralized archives.
Even in the late 20th century, utilizing modern structural engineering, localized water damage easily obliterated decades of institutional memory.
Water and fire are still erasing history right now.
Which forces us to confront the central, terrifying dilemma of physical archiving. If every physical medium, whether it is Egyptian papyrus, Roman parchment, or modern industrial paper, is inherently vulnerable to rapid, catastrophic degradation, how can a society engineer a genuinely permanent mechanism to preserve its most vital foundational principles?
Because if every building is ultimately a single point of failure, where do you store the data to ensure it survives geopolitical collapse?
Exactly.
Well, according to the Masons, you stop relying on physical media entirely. You bypass the vulnerability of the object by encoding the data directly into the behavioral architecture of the human beings themselves.
Which is fascinating.
You engineer a system of intense, ritualized shared experience that transmits the core data from generation to generation without ever requiring a single piece of paper. And this is exactly the mechanism detailed in that 1997 bulletin from the Grand Lodge of Alberta regarding the structural function of Freemasonry.
Freemasonry is often obscured by layers of conspiratorial static, right?
Oh, absolutely.
But Reverend Canon Richard Tideman's analysis in the bulletin strips away all that mythology to reveal a highly sophisticated sociological archiving system. He defines Freemasonry not as a religion or a political syndicate, but as a peculiar system of morality, veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols.
Originating in 18th century Britain, right?
Yeah, as a direct response to a societal environment perceived to be overwhelmed by corruption and moral decay. A group of individuals sought to establish a framework for rigid moral integrity, trust, and mutual service.
But the brilliant tactical decision they made was in how they chose to record and transmit those moral laws.
Right, because they understood that simply publishing a manifesto or writing a rule book was structurally weak.
A book can be ignored, it can be misinterpreted, and it can be burned.
Exactly. Instead, they co-opted the specialized vernacular and physical tools of ancient operative stonemasons to create an architectural language for human behavior.
They engineered an allegorical system where the individual human being is conceptualized as a rough stone that must be meticulously shaped and refined to fit into a massive, structurally sound moral edifice.
And they utilized the physical instruments of the builder, the square, the level, the plumb line, as permanent mnemonic devices.
So, just as a physical stone must be perfectly square and upright to ensure the structural integrity of a cathedral, the internal morality of the individual must be perfectly aligned to ensure the structural integrity of the society.
The physical tool is a constant, tangible reminder of an abstract philosophical concept.
It is an incredibly robust method for archiving an idea. But, okay, examining the mechanics of their initiation rituals raises a massive psychological question for me.
Go for it.
If the ultimate objective is simply to promote basic moral integrity, to be honest in your dealings and supportive of your community, why implement such intense theatrical secrecy?
The rituals.
Right. Tiedman's bulletin details that a candidate petitioning to join the organization must undergo a profoundly disorienting physical ritual. They are required to enter the lodge, blindfolded, physically hobbled, stripped of their standard clothing, entirely devoid of money or metallic objects, and in some variations wearing a halter or a noose.
Yeah, it's intense.
That is an objectively terrifying, deeply humiliating physical ordeal. Why engineer such a bizarre, severe entry protocol for a society dedicated to basic morality?
Because the severity of the ritual is the core technology of the preservation system. Tiedman's analysis isolates the psychological brilliance of this mechanism, the concept of shared experience. The secrecy surrounding the ritual is not designed to conceal illicit activities from the external world.
Okay, then what is it doing?
It is designed to fiercely protect the psychological payload of the initiation itself.
Break that down for me. How does the humiliation archive the morality?
Well, human psychology is wired to forge the most resilient, unbreakable bonds through enduring shared adversity or profound vulnerability. We see this mechanical reality in rigorous military training regimens, where individuals are systematically broken down to forge a cohesive, fiercely loyal unit.
Oh, like boot camp.
Exactly. Tiedman argues that to genuinely accept the egalitarian principles of the organization, a candidate must be forcibly stripped of every single external metric of status, wealth, and societal power.
Ah, I see. The mechanics of the blindfold and the poverty. If you are a billionaire CEO or a high-ranking political official, you cannot leverage your capital to bypass the vulnerability.
Nope. The ritual physically enforces total indigence and sensory deprivation. You are rendered entirely dependent on the guidance of the individuals inside the room.
It engineers a state of absolute, undeniable equality. When the blindfold is eventually removed, the candidate is acutely aware that every single individual in that room, regardless of their external socioeconomic dominance, has endured the exact same humiliating, deeply vulnerable ordeal.
You cannot read about that vulnerability in a text. It must be neurologically experienced. That visceral shared experience is the actual secret of Freemasonry. It's a fabricated, intense psychological state that permanently binds the individuals together in mutual empathy.
And that fundamentally recontextualizes the passwords, the complex handshakes, and the cryptic signs.
They aren't the actual secrets.
Right. The handshake does not contain the moral philosophy. The passwords are merely the security protocols. They are the cryptographic locks on the door, designed solely to verify that every single person operating within that space has survived the fire of the shared experience.
It is the ultimate evolution of the archive. They took the core behavioral data they wanted to preserve, encoded it into architectural mnemonic devices, and locked it inside a highly guarded, emotionally profound ritual.
It's an unbroken chain of living memory passed directly from human to human. You can flood a library in Nevada, you can burn a palatial complex in Alexandria, but you cannot physically burn down a shared psychological experience. As long as the ritual is enacted, the archive survives.
Which really proves that a static piece of data, a scroll sitting unread on a dusty shelf, is functionally dead. Memory requires active, kinetic participation to survive.
Looking back at the massive timeline we've covered today, the mechanics of preservation dictate the survival of the species.
They do.
We watched ancient scribes press their administrative realities into the mud of Mesopotamia. We tracked the cognitive explosion triggered by the alphabet, allowing the human brain to objectify its own thoughts and engineer the massive bureaucratic machineries of Athens and Rome.
We analyzed the ruthless, centralized gravity wells constructed by the Ptolemies.
And how the fatal vulnerability of physical media, whether papyrus or paper, led to catastrophic erasures in Alexandria and St. Louis. And finally, we saw how systems like Freemasonry bypass the physical object entirely, choosing to construct living archives out of human behavior and shared vulnerability.
The overarching lesson here is really one of structural intentionality. How a society engineers its archival systems, whether they rely on baked clay or centralized paper facilities or decentralized human ritual, directly dictates the resolution at which future generations will be able to perceive them.
The medium a culture selects is a definitive vote for what they deem essential enough to endure the friction of time.
Exactly.
And analyzing the trajectory of these mediums leaves us with a genuinely terrifying reality for you to consider today. We track the evolution of memory from highly durable baked clay to the somewhat volatile organic reality of papyrus and paper to our current apex, incredibly ephemeral digital electrons.
Yeah, the cloud.
Right. We operate under the supreme confidence that we are the most advanced, meticulously documented society in human history because we export every fragment of our existence to the cloud. We have generated unimaginable exabytes of data, our global financial architecture, our personal communications, our scientific modeling.
But that entire digital ecosystem is predicated on a flawlessly uninterrupted supply of electrical power and the continuous translation of rapidly obsolete software formats.
Exactly. If a massive localized solar flare severely degrades our global power grid, or if our highly specific digital formatting simply degrades beyond retrieval in a few centuries, we possess no physical redundancies.
None.
We could theoretically leave behind absolutely zero decipherable records. We are engineering a scenario where we might become a literal dark age to future archaeologists. They might excavate our sprawling silent server farms and possess exponentially less granular data about our lives than we currently possess about a Sumerian scribe tracking grain shipments. And it's all because we didn't have the foresight to bake our hard drives in the mud.